Christopher Ward GMT is a value-packed watch. I really like this thing. And today we're going to talk about it and how it compares to two of the other steel bezel watches that I've had in recently. Today we're talking about the Christopher Ward Sealander GMT. It's kind of a mouthful. Christopher Ward is a brand that has had some teething issues when it comes to their logo and name and that sort of thing. And so it's created some controversy around that. Watch collectors either hate having Christopher Ward name on it, or they hate having the logo, or they don't like where it's positioned. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but mainly to talk about this watch. This thing is really nice. When I first got into a steel bezel GMT, I knew I wanted one because I'd been lusting after an Explorer II for a while, and I really was at the point where I wanted to buy a Speedmaster, so I didn't really think I was going to buy an Explorer II. And so I decided to buy a Sealander to kind of avoid me buying an Explorer II. So I bought the white dial version, and I had it for about 20 days before I bought the Speedmaster. I didn't take it off for the first 7 days, and I knew I was never gonna wear the Sealander again, and so I sent it back. So the one that we have in today is the black dial version. The specs are on the screen. The watch itself, design-wise, is going to be what you expect. There's a plethora of steel bezel GMT watches out on the market right now. You've got Grand Seiko, you've got obviously Rolex, you've got Tudor, you've got Christopher Ward, and you've got even more than just that. And a lot of them are taking similar cues from the Explorer II and doing it in their own way. A steel bezel does not mean that it is an homage of the Explorer II. So let's nip that in the bud right now. Just because someone uses a fixed steel bezel doesn't make an homage. It just means they took a really good idea and thought, let's re-envision it. So if we take that aside and we look at the watch in general, the way that it's designed, it is a nice looking watch. And for the value, it's really there. This watch, this black dial one, I bought from Christopher Ward for $740. And I bought it from Christopher Ward through their clearance section for $740. Now, if you can show me a watch that looks like this for $740 from the company that manufactured it, then you win. This thing is very impressive. The case design does a really nice mix of brushed surfaces and polished surfaces. And so it has a really nice aesthetic to it as you look at the side of the case. It's a little tubby, and I'll get in that in the negatives, but the overall design architecture is really well thought through. I think they call it a light catcher case, is really nice in those polished surfaces at the very top where it meets the top of the lugs, and then underneath before it meets the bottom side of the lugs. Does a nice way of breaking up those lugs and kind of adding some interest to the watch. The indices, the layout, the hour hands, the design of the inner dial is beautiful. I really like the hour hands and some of the extra polish that they add to it. I like the orange GMT hand. I like the minute hand. I like the Trident counterweight. I know some people don't, but I actually really like the counterweight. I think it adds a really interesting nautical little touch and unique flavor to the watch. So I really like that. The steel bezel, not my favorite. It's a little thin. And I think that's because I've gotten used to looking at, dive watches and then looking at the Pro and then looking at my Explorer II, that now when I look at this, I noticed something I didn't notice when I first had it, which is that the bezel's really small. In overall dimension, you can see it on your screen compared to the other two I was talking about. You can see that it's really actually low in profile, and so those numbers are a little squat. And I think it makes that dial look a lot bigger. And if I had to guess, I would say that it's probably because they came out the Sealander line, which is their fixed bezel version of the same watch, and their GMT at the same time, and they likely just took the same case, put a different bezel on it, and then threw a different Sellita S3300 inside instead of a standard Sellita movement so they can make it a GMT. And while I understand that from a business standpoint, from a cost standpoint, it completely makes sense. From a design standpoint, I want that bezel to be a little bit bigger. I want it to take up more presence, to look more like a sports watch in its traditional sense, with a thicker bezel, a smaller dial, that sort of thing. So the dial looks a little oversized for the bezel itself. The crown, really well knurled, great action on it. I like the embossed logo on the side, and I like the movement in there. Sellita is a very nice movement manufacturer, and that's to be expected. They essentially took the patented versions of the ETA movements and started making them because the patents had expired. So you would imagine that they would be pretty well built. This is a collar GMT, so you're not going to be able to set the hour hand independent. You've got a first position to set the 24-hour hand and to also set the date, quick set date, and then the second position to actually set the time. So that as a note, this is going to be a collar GMT. No problem with that. I don't have any problem with that, but just something you should know. So positives, I kind of went over some of them. The main ones for me are going to be the value for money, which is a hard thing for me to say because sometimes when I say value for money, it makes me feel like I'm convincing myself on a watch because I feel like it's a good value rather than I love the design. So my second positive is just the overall design layout. I really like what they've done. I like the logo being at 12 o'clock rather than at 9 o'clock on some of their old models. I love the date being at 6 and with the same color date wheel so that it kind of vanishes. I like the indice shape and style, the hour hands, the minute hand, the GMT hand, the counterbalance on the second hand. I like the whole design with the exception, obviously, the bezel. That's in the negative. So positive just being that it's really well built, it's really nice, and this thing just gets the job done. If you're looking for a steel bezel GMT, but you aren't in love with it, you're not dreaming of having an Explorer II or Grand Seiko GMT or Tudor Black Bay Pro, then this does a lot of that, giving you that feeling with a different design. It's not an homage in my eyes, and so it gives you just enough of a difference for a really nice price. The movement, the crown, all of that also, big fan, and the case design, big fan of that, with the exception, as I move into the negatives, being the thickness. And it's not that it's a thick watch, it's actually very thin, but it looks a little tubby. Those lugs don't kind of continue from the case side, and so they kind of just flare out, and so it makes it more noticeable that you've got these relatively thin, smaller lugs that kind of branch out of what then looks like a tubbier, fatter case. And as I said, it's a thin watch. So it's not actually tubby, it's just the illusion makes it look a little strange, and design-wise, I'm not a huge fan of that. I think the lugs could have continued out of the case and looked a little bit nicer. The steel bezel is by far my biggest negative on this and my biggest gripe. It's too small. And I understand why they did it functionally and from a business standpoint, but I wish it were bigger. I wish the dial were smaller. I think if they brought everything down and kind of fit it in more of that typical steel bezel GMT watch, it would have appealed to me a lot more. Other negative, this strap on it. This is their Tide strap. I don't like this thing. It's stiff. Maybe it'll wear in over time, but I'm not a fan. I like things to be relatively supple out of the box, and this thing is very thick. Now I understand it's ocean recycled and that's great, but in terms of wearability, not a fan of the strap that it came on. It is quick release, and they do have a quick release bracelet, which I think also has micro adjustments built in, which is really nice, but the overall strap, not a big fan. The last half negative is the fact that I just like the white dial more. I think the black dial, while nice in the fact that it's subtle and understated, you don't see those orange elements nearly as much as you do on the white dial. And so it feels kind of muddled down and a lot more somber than the white dial. The white dial with those orange accents really pop. And I feel like it looks a lot nicer than this version. It's not really a negative, but if you're interested in these and you're kind of debating, I would go for the white dial. I think it looks nicer. I think those elements pop a little bit more, and it had more character than the black dial one. So what do you guys think on the Christopher Ward Sealander GMT? Do you have a Sealander? Have you looked at their other models? And is there anything that I missed? I know they swapped the Christopher Ward out with their logo. Do me a favor and subscribe. As of right now, I've been buying most of these watches, this being a good example in order to review them. So the more people I can have on board, the more I can have people actually send me watches. That would be really helpful. So till the next one, take care.